Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to today's Plug and Play Supply Chain webinar. My name is Frederic Bohn. I'm the head of revenue for Plug and Play Supply Chain, and I and the team are excited to have the opportunity to cover one of the most hyped and promising trends of recent years, blockchain. Today, we'll hear from industry-leading experts, bleeding-edge startups, and answer the question, what is new in blockchain? But before we dive into a content-filled session, let me hand it over to Mike Zayons, founder of the Plug and Play Supply Chain program, to kick it off with some opening remarks. Mike, the stage is yours.
Sounds great. Thank you, Frederic, and welcome everyone. Great to have everyone here wherever you're dialing in from around the world for today's webinar. We're really excited about today's topic. The supply chain program, we started it about three and a half years ago, and I mean, blockchain was one of the four initial technology areas that we looked at, and we've seen this kind of roller coaster of opportunities in blockchain over the last few years. We do believe that the ecosystem we build is very important to helping get this blockchain kind of platforms off the ground, and we see a huge opportunity in the blockchain sector, and that's why we've been aggressively investing in the sector over the last few years. Since we started the program, we've also witnessed things like ICOs go crazy. We saw startups without use cases raise millions and millions of dollars and then say, okay, we need to figure out what our product is. But for us, I mean, what it really comes down to is what are the corporate use cases that the businesses are actually solving? And I really believe that there's some great opportunities in blockchain. And over the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be a huge emergence of these technologies. And that's why we continue to invest aggressively. I'll talk a little bit just about Plug and Play's background for those of you who are new to Plug and Play and our webinars. So, I mean, Plug and Play, we were founded back in the 90s, 2000s with our founder and CEO, Saeed Amidi. So Saeed was from a very wealthy family in Iran. He moved to the United States after the 1979 Iranian Revolution. And now it says he started about 17 different businesses. And he ended up buying one of his businesses when he bought a ton of commercial real estate, mostly in Palo Alto area in Silicon Valley, right next to Stanford University, which turned out to be a very good investment back in the 90s because some of these tenants actually started within one of his buildings, 165 University Avenue. So Google, their founders, Larry and Sergey, moved in. It was their first office space. They grew all the way to 50 employees. And then in the exact same building, Logitech ended up growing with their founder, Pierluigi Zappacosta, moving from Europe and ended up IPOing. Obviously, Logitech is doing very well due to video conferencing these days and has since then grown significantly. But why Saeed got very excited in the early days was because he saw these technology companies grow faster than any other business that he started or been involved in. So he decided, okay, maybe I'm in the wrong business here in Silicon Valley. I can make a few of angel investments or play a closer role working with these startups. So he ended up making an investment in PayPal, which was about a $100K investment that he took instead of 2 years of rent from PayPal, which at the time people are probably not really sure what he was doing, but now they're thinking he's a genius because obviously when PayPal was acquired by eBay for 1.5 billion, Plug and Play made a very large return on that investment. And we ended up investing a lot more aggressively into startups and believing a lot more in this space. The last company I'll talk about is a company named Danger. This is Andy Rubin's company. It was the operating system on the T-Mobile Sidekick phone. And we invested about 400K into that company from our initial building. They were bought by Microsoft for 500 million. But then the founder, Andy Rubin, went on to create Android. And as you know, Android and Google are now together. And where they kind of built this initial partnership and started this working together under the same umbrella was because they were connected in the same ecosystem in the same building that Plug and Play owned. So where we really believe is enabling this ecosystem, and we need to bring these different participants in the ecosystem to be successful. These are just some of the portfolio companies we've invested in over the years. Plug and Play has over 1,000 portfolio companies today. We've invested in over 10 unicorns. Some of our most successful unicorns include Dropbox, Lending Club, which is the largest IPO in the United States in 2014, which does peer-to-peer lending. We also, in the fintech space, invested in N26, which became the fastest growing bank in Europe. And in the supply chain space, a company I'm excited about is Rappi, which is a last mile delivery company, which became the first unicorn in Colombia. That team is headquartered in Bogota, but they have this huge delivery network and now raised just last year $1 billion from SoftBank. These are just some of the corporate partners that we work with specifically in the supply chain program. I'm excited that in the supply chain program, we really bring the end-to-end supply chain together, making it a great opportunity to bring technologies to market, like where you're looking at technologies in the food supply chain from farm to fork, for example, so you can track across the different networks in a safe and kind of efficient manner and reliable manner. These are just some of the partners we work with, but you can see we work with a lot of the largest Fortune 500 companies like Exxon, Shell, Walmart, and every mode of transportation in the supply chain. These are just the different verticals that we have at Plug and Play. So we really have programs in every single industry. And if we don't, reach out to us. I mean, we're always looking to expand. We are investing in every single industry in an opportunistic way. I'm obviously leading and mostly focused on the supply chain program, but I'm very excited about collaborating with other verticals at Plug and Play. And we did launch a few new initiatives this year focused on sustainability, with the Alliance to End Plastic Waste being a huge component of that, where we look at kind of reducing the cost of plastics around the world with some of the largest corporations, as well as the COVID-19 accelerator, which is a really interesting platform because it's a completely virtual accelerator. Obviously, today, Plug and Play has moved all our activities online. So we're excited to enable this collaboration the same way we used to do it in our beautiful big building in Sunnyvale. So kind of on the next slide, you can see just some of the recognition Plug and Play has received over the years. We were named the kind of largest venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. This is mostly in terms of deals done. We are also named, in the Bay Area, one of the most active VCs in 2018. So we are extremely active as an investor. And then we were also named the kind of the landlord for the most startups in 2017 and 2018. We still have a lot of startups normally in our building, but right now it's completely empty, as you can imagine, due to the coronavirus pandemic. But obviously we're excited to move these activities online, and I feel that we're making a lot of these meaningful connections despite not being able to connect to everyone in person, as we always do. This is just some of the trends that or just some of the opportunities I see in the supply chain market. We've been seeing an incredible amount of venture capital going into the market at almost an exponential rate. Since I started the program in 2016, 2017, with the initial concept, we've seen a lot of growth, a lot of huge funding rounds for different startups, and we continue to see this. And in light of the coronavirus pandemic, we're anticipating an increasingly big opportunity for a lot of startups that are solving challenges in the supply chain that can help with social distancing, safety, and different trends that we're seeing that are important in today's market. These are just, when we survey our partners, some of the big trends we're looking at, but we love looking at startups in robotics, last mile delivery, machine learning, IoT sensors, tracking. The technology areas haven't really changed over the years. I would say, to be honest, blockchain has probably gone down since we started the program. That's gone through this, a lot of people have seen the Gartner hype cycle where it went super hype, where Bitcoin prices exploded and then crashed. But I think this is just kind of validating in the long term, there's going to be some big opportunities in the blockchain space. We are investing aggressively in the space. You can see in terms of deal count, we are named one of the most active investors in the market, and we continue to believe in the market. We think that there will be some very big winners eventually once the industries are able to come together. And I think supply chain is definitely a good use case for a lot of these blockchain startups. If you look at just kind of the size of the blockchain technology market worldwide and the anticipated growth, this is kind of just some statistics where we've seen the actual growth versus where the predicted growth is. We think this is an exponential opportunity. Before the internet became big, there's a few early adopters, and then everyone moved on to it. And we see the same kind of opportunities with blockchain, which is why, as a venture capital firm, we see always a very strong interest in investing in startups that have a strong blockchain solution with a real business use case that can scale to a variety of our corporate partners. We see this as a global opportunity. Plug and Play being a global firm, we are investing on a worldwide basis. We have portfolio companies on every continent. We have a ton of success stories, as I mentioned, with N26 in Europe, with Rappi in Latin America. We've also been investing aggressively in China, in Singapore and India, for example. But we definitely see blockchain as a global opportunity and something that will be scaled around the world. And that's why I think Plug and Play really kind of can take advantage of this ecosystem. We are investing at a global level. We have offices worldwide. As you can see, the larger offices are the supply chain offices, but the other ones are offices that are focusing on different areas. Like, for example, in Toronto, Detroit, we're looking at the automotive sector and the mobility industry. In Paris, we're looking at fashion tech. We're looking at fintech with BNP Paribas. We're also doing a lot of work in different parts of the world, like in Abu Dhabi. We work with some of the largest financial institutions. So we're really partnering with a lot of these specific corporations and making every single program have a very specific theme and interest area. So I'm definitely excited to kind of leverage Plug and Play's opportunity of finding global startups, bringing them to market. I really appreciate kind of the panelists. I'm really looking forward to the discussions today. I know Keith Dirks from IBM very well. He's a close advisor, friend of our program, who was able to recommend Stephen, the kind of keynote speaker from IBM. I know IBM has been working with the TradeLens platform over a number of years. Since we partnered with Maersk in 2017, that was always a big component of what they would discuss and something that they were trying to promote to the industry. And I know there was a slow adoption in the beginning, but we definitely see a huge opportunity in the long run for a lot of these technologies. So whether it's an agile startup or a major corporate platform like the TradeLens platform with IBM, we are excited about the blockchain space, and we're excited to bring this ecosystem together. We feel Plug and Play through our global ecosystem can really bring together a lot of these important components of the whole ecosystem. So thank you, everyone. Looking forward to today's webinar. Back to my friend and colleague, Frederick Bond.
Thank you, Mike. As always, it's been a pleasure to have you with us. So as Mike mentioned, now let's continue with today's keynote speaker, Stephen Rogers, VP of Blockchain Initiatives for Supply Chain Platform Services at IBM. Stephen is a true IBM veteran, having joined the company in 1981. He moved through engineering, controlling, finance, and operations departments before joining the supply chain organization in 2002, where he has been heading transformation and blockchain initiatives since 2013 and 2017, respectively. He prides himself as being a blockchain practitioner, having implemented countless technologies himself, and even has a patent pending. Long story short, you're in for a treat. And with that, Stephen, the stage is yours.
Great. Thank you very much. All right. Now, for some reason, I think I just lost my presentation. Oh, there it is. Okay. I'm going to put it in screen show. Hopefully everybody can see. Can you see my screen? Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We cannot see your screen yet.
All right. So I just got a little pop-up that says start my video. How's that? All right. Let me.
Your video is great.
Okay. So let me go back to Zoom and screen share. Desktop. How's that?
Perfect.
Is that better? Okay. So let me start the screen share again. All right. Get rid of that. I think we're ready. Okay. So I am responsible for implementing blockchain initiatives across our supply chain, and when we perceive that some of them have legs, we will actually try to commercialize them. I have worked on TradeLens. Right now I'm spending a really good portion of my time bringing a solution to market with a partner called ChainYard that is called Trust Your Supplier, which is a digital identity solution for suppliers. Well, what I'm going to talk about is a little bit about blockchain, some important lessons that we've learned, and then where I think blockchain is going. But one of my most important messages is that blockchain is not the panacea that a lot of people think it is, that it solves every problem. It is an important technology, and I think it's one of the key technologies that are revolutionizing supply chain. As the head of our supply chain stated last year in a speech, she said, boy, it's been a long time, but I think supply chain is sexy again. And certainly the COVID-19 pandemic has heightened everybody's awareness of how important supply chains are. But when I look at these 4 key technologies, right? The first one being a hybrid cloud, right? The second one being artificial intelligence, and the third one being robotic process automation. Combining those with blockchain is what is really creating this tightly integrated planning and execution process for supply chain. And I really need to update this chart and include now 5G and edge computing. But blockchain solves a particular set of problems better than any of the other technologies. It works with those other technologies, but it is not the end all be all. So just a couple of charts on the promise of blockchain, right? It's going to save you time because you're going to pull out a lot of the third-party trust providers. It's going to remove costs because all of those providers that generate a level of trust charge you a fee in their process, right? That's how they make their money. It's going to reduce risk because you're going to have information that you can trust. Because all of the players in the network are, hosting these nodes that are going to have a consensus process that ensures that they're always aligned. And obviously, any increase in trust is just like putting grease on machinery. It improves the process from end to end. So how does it do that? The first key attribute of blockchain is this concept of the shared ledger. That is not in and of itself new, but the fact that this is an append-only ledger, meaning that any data that's written to it is not written over the old data, it's added to that history of data. And having been a controller for 15 years in my life, I understand how advantageous that would have been at certain points in time in my career. How do you keep all of those different nodes or different computer systems all aligned to the same key piece of data? And you have to have a consensus process. And that consensus process can be extremely onerous, like it is with Bitcoin, take a lot of energy and a lot of time to process, so you have low throughput, or it can be very light, right? And it's selectable with the Hyperledger Fabric solution for blockchain. Also, it can execute smart contracts. It's not just, is the data the same, right? Does my node have the same data your node has? But I will run a program, and do I get the same answer that your particular node gets, which is important to protect against malware. I never say that blockchain is unhackable because any of the individual nodes could be hacked into. But I always say it's tamper evident in the fact that if somebody gets hacked into, there's usually a monetary reason for that, and that is to transact either misrepresenting who they are or misrepresenting the data in the transactions. That becomes immediately apparent to a blockchain network. However, all of those things together, right, weren't going to get business to adopt this technology because of the need for privacy, right? And privacy is that critical element that business needs. I am not going to share all my information with anybody on this network. I'm going to share just the relevant information with the people who need to have visibility to that information. So how does it do that? This is kind of a simple diagram. You can get into all kinds of complex science and math, especially around the consensus process itself and technologies like, you know, zero knowledge proof. And I just came from a presentation where essentially Fabric, as part of the Hyperledger project, as well as the Sawtooth project, are kind of coming together on security and integrity so that you can process data in a blockchain in a way that nobody can actually see the data. Nobody, not even an administrator or anybody in the network. And it's kind of, you know, there are really some interesting use cases for that, like voting and you know, bidding processes and things like that. But the key difference between a blockchain process and any other, you know, IT solution that you have is that, you know, normally in any other process, when a transaction gets booked, that's it. It just happens. But in a blockchain network, you have to propose to the network that a transaction, you know, should be booked by the network. And that transaction is broadcast to the peers nodes in the network. They all, you know, run their smart contracts, you know, check their data and execute the consensus process. And only when those criteria are met is the transaction actually booked. And when it is booked, as I mentioned before, you keep the history of what went before it. And so that's pretty key and pretty revolutionary, you know. And you know, if you look at it, you know, it was the shared ledger and the consensus process that was given to us by Bitcoin. The smart contracts was given to us by Ethereum, and the privacy element was given to us by the Hyperledger efforts. So I break up the use cases into four key categories within supply chain, right? The first one is provenance. And that is, you know, where did this come from? Who touched it? What did they do to it? And so I've got proof of this information, and I can go backwards when I need to. And food is a really good example of why that is important. Today, we throw out, you know, all, romaine lettuce or all spinach if there's a listeria or E. coli breakout. Wouldn't it be better if we knew exactly where that came from and only those people who had gotten supplied by that source would have to throw out their product? That would be a much better solution, and that's what food trust is all about. Shared visibility is that second one, and as was mentioned earlier, our work with Maersk on TradeLens is a really good example of that. Having all the parties in a transaction be able to see the data and see the data in a format that they've all agreed to, so that we're not, you know, struggling over basic definitions. The third category is dispute resolution, right? Which is, you know, if you and I have different systems, different operating systems and database structures and nomenclatures. Sooner or later, we're going to disagree on basic information, and we have to sit down and resolve that before somebody pays the other person, right? But if you are working with data on a blockchain and you're sharing that information and you're all looking at the same information, you are going to eliminate the problem associated with those disputes. And it has boggled my mind to learn all the different places in a given enterprise where you are doing dispute management in your AR, in your AP, in your system to system reconciliations. It's actually mind-boggling. IBM implemented a solution with our contractors for what we call contingent labor, right? And we eliminated pretty much 99% of the disputes, right? It was absolutely amazing. And we took 30 people that were doing nothing but trying to solve those problems, and we put them back to real work. The last category I call identity management. It's really about proving who you are. And this applies to corporations, it applies to individuals, and it applies to IoT devices. Really, the corporations and the IoT devices are the things that are really important in the supply chain. Individuals is important to all of us in our daily lives, right? So that we don't have to prove who we are to different companies over and over again, right? And supplier onboarding is an example of that, which is a really good use case, and that's what this solution that I mentioned before, Trust Your Supplier, is all about. This is a similar view of that, but it looks at it through the lens of supply chain, right? And with this, that lens, you can see, market planning, make-buy decisions, deliver, fulfilling, and operations. All of these are use cases that I've personally been involved in, either within IBM or with clients of IBM. I've highlighted just a few of them here because they don't necessarily leap to top of mind as a good use case, but loyalty programs, if I could see you all and I could ask you to raise your hands and say how many of you like your loyalty programs with your airlines, I doubt there'd be very many hands in the air. And one of the main reasons is the difficulty in actually using all the points that you've accumulated. But think about opening that up to companies that provide you services that you have to use in your daily life, whether it's dry cleaning or ordering pizzas and stuff like that. And blockchain can allow you to do that. For companies that sell through resellers, trade promotions has always been an incredibly administrative, incredibly difficult process to execute. Right? Because nobody's just going to give marketing funds, give advertising funds, give special discounts, unless they can prove that they've done the things that you want them to do. And having worked in the PC business, which was obviously always a reseller business, that was something that we learned the hard way, and I would have loved to have blockchain to solve some of those things. But fraud prevention is another key area. There are lots of physical technologies that, from simple serialization to very, very complex things like the light refraction off of a pill that you can tell whether or not it actually has the genuine chemical properties that came out of that factory. But all of those different physical technologies need that information to be stored on a blockchain so that it can be shared securely with multiple different players in the supply chain, right? So I think there are essentially three major ways to run a business model to bring blockchain technology to market to help solve a problem, right? Number one, you can organize an industry group for the betterment of everybody that's in that group. And then you solicit, from them contributions to pay for the development and the running of the network. A good example of that is the Responsible Sourcing Business Blockchain Network, which is set up to first start out with cobalt, which is the main ingredient in batteries. And many companies are realizing that the major product or the major component of their project comes from sources where people have pointed guns at children and said, go into that mine and dig me out some cobalt. And so how do we assess that the mines are operating properly and the supply chain is protected so that no infiltration takes place from sources that have not been proven to be ethical in their process? And that's the way that they're funding that project. The next one is to take an existing business network, right? And there are many business networks, right? Whether it's SAP Ariba's or Cooper's or Project 44's, right? There are dozens of companies that facilitate the actual transactional information to do business. IBM has one called Sterling Supply Chain Business Network, and we introduced blockchain to that solution so that instead of a bunch of point-to-point conversations, we have multi-party conversations, but they're set up only when you have a problem, right? And that, if you do that and you use an existing business network, then all the work of creating that business network and soliciting people to participate and enlisting them, you don't have to do. That lastly is you work with a few industry leading partner companies and you develop a solution and then you go recruit other companies to join. So TradeLens and Food Trust, the two that I mentioned earlier, are examples of those. TradeLens charges transaction fees. Food Trust charges subscription fees. So there are different pricing models, right, inside that simple business model. These are the four key messages that I'd like to leave you with before I talk a little bit about what's on the horizon, right? So the first one is you can either build or join a network, and I'll show you a chart as to what does that really mean. Convening a network is as much work as the development of the solution. You must understand that blockchain is a business transformation, not an IT transformation. And every participant in the blockchain network has got to have a value proposition or they will not join. And most likely you will fail in getting all the key elements of your network to come together and work together. And then lastly, and this one is really just beginning to really see the fruits of, is once these networks or platforms are put in place, there is a tremendous opportunity for innovation. And I'll show you an example of that. So this chart really talks to those first 2 points. That first project, that proof of concept, and I'll show you a chart later that shows that the number of proof of concepts is actually going down because most people are now convinced of the technology itself. And that first project with a minimum viable product and a minimum viable ecosystem, a lot of them have been very successful. But once you get past that and you want to actually put something into a pilot mode, and then from there into production, you can see from the list of things, I won't read them to you, but these are now a whole bunch of business decisions that you have to make, and you have to make them as a group, right? As the consortium, which demonstrates to you just how important it is to make that decision up front. Do I want to join something where all of those work items have already been taken care of, right? Or do I want to build something myself where I get to, architect it, but I have to lead all of this work, right? And then, the second key point, it is, I think, also evident from here, right? So now I'm going to kind of jump on this point associated with the value proposition for everybody. I'm not going to take you through the inner workings of TradeLens because that would take too long. But here's the chart on why we decided to try and solve this problem, right? It's $16 trillion in goods. 80% of everything you touch on a daily basis came in a sea container at some point in time. And this is probably, solving this problem is probably the biggest thing we can do to increase the economic growth of the world, right? And it can be predominantly beneficial to countries that need that economic growth. So this is a kind of a picture of the process as it exists today. All these players are in this system, right? From customs brokers to the producers, to the carriers, to the port terminal operators, and all of the different authorities that hold some degree of sway over these participants. And when we started this, the freight forwarders down on the lower left of this chart, they were feeling like they were going to be disenfranchised because they sold information to the producers as to where their shipments were. And that was a key aspect of their business. And we pointed out to them that their information was not very good. And if they joined this network, it would improve dramatically. And we would wholesale the information to them and they could retell it to their customers through the interfaces that their customers were used to looking for. That got them on board and helped us grow this network. And that is a key example of what I mean by every participant in the network has got to see a piece of value out of this, right? The next one I'm going to talk about is food trust. This is the chart on why we decided to try and tackle this problem. 1 out of 10 people on this call is going to get a foodborne illness within the next year. Right? It's unbelievable how much paper is still going on in this business. And we waste 1/3 of the food that we produce. And there's a tremendous amount of fraud in this food industry. It's estimated that in New York City, over 35% of all seafood is a different species than what it is advertised to be. So we put together this blockchain solution, but once it was in place, Golden State Foods said, I've got a client who wants to shift from frozen hamburger meat to fresh hamburger meat. Frozen hamburger meat has 70 days to be used. Fresh hamburger meat has 7 days to be used. Think about the dramatic difference in their supply chain. And they built that, but they could not have built it. They added IoT and RFID technology to the existing platform, the blockchain platform that existed, and that allowed them to satisfy the requirements of their customer, and it was a fairly big success for them. And so the last 2 charts, these are all different sources, but these are all predictions, right? So 10% of global GDP will be stored on blockchains or blockchain-related technology by 2025. That's the World Economic Forum. 176 billion in business value added by blockchain by 2025, according to Gartner. And then that jumps very dramatically to 3.1 trillion by 2030. This is IBM's Business Institute of Business Value did a survey with major banks, and 66% of them claim to have a commercial blockchain application this year, and $23 billion estimated size of the blockchain technology market by next year, right? So these are the major trends that are evolving. As I mentioned before, POCs are actually going down because nobody feels the need to prove the technology anymore. And what's actually going on currently is you're seeing platform industrialization. IBM has a blockchain platform, so does SAP, so does Google, right? And these are providing, plug and play capabilities so that people don't have to make major investments in the basic, features and functions. They can actually just go buy that. Industries are rallying around best practices. They are beginning to work with one another because they all want to see an improvement in their process. Centers of gravity are forming, whether that be like Mobi in mobility or Beta in trucking, right? But what's coming in the future, and the key trends are in emerging standards and governance, right? Emerging consortia. And as these different blockchain solutions come to market, a network of networks is being formed. Nobody wants to do again what somebody else has already done. Let me just connect my systems to yours, which is one of the driving forces behind the need for people to, or the need for the different blockchain operating systems, if you will, to work together, whether that's Ethereum and Hyperledger or Corda, and everybody is sending representatives to everybody else's development teams so that that takes place. Right, so I will conclude this portion and open it up for Q&A, and you can read the key points on this. I'm a big believer in the technology, and I think that that people are doing some amazing things with it because I get to see a lot of what is happening out there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephen. I think a good transition from your last point would actually be a question that we got from Bart Boudreau. With technologies like zero-knowledge proofs emerging, do you see things converging around a public blockchain? So the network of networks, I assume, that you mentioned at the very last point.
I think that the network of networks is going to be a mixture of private and public blockchains. Right, because there are still going to be areas where businesses are not going to be willing to share that information, and just use TradeLens as an example, right? So the key commercial documentation, whether they be phytosanitary certificates or commercial invoices, right? All that documentation, right, is not going to be, the participants are not going to be willing to share that with their competitors, right? So Maersk does not want Hapag-Lloyd or Costco to see their transactions. And the same thing with the other companies. They have to be convinced that their particular information will be shared forward and backward with the companies that are important for them to solve their challenges, but not be shared with the competition. But there will be many, many use cases that will be public. Payments is a really good example of that. Why build a separate private payment system when there's going to be any number of them competing out there in the public marketplace?
For sure. I actually have a question myself, since TradeLens was mentioned a couple of times, and you mentioned it again. What would your biggest learning of the initiative be? what would you maybe do differently if you would have to do it all over
That
again?
one is easy for me, because I was in the midst of it while we were making this mistake. And that is, we worked privately with Maersk and IBM to build this solution for too long, right? We needed to be more transparent early on with all the other carriers, because once we had it, we figured, oh, we'll just show it to them and they'll be convinced that this is a good thing for everybody. But they had built up such suspicion around it. It took us a year to convince all the other carriers as to why this was beneficial for the entire industry, right? And so that's why the minimum viable ecosystem concept is as important as the minimum viable product in your early stages of development, right? You need to figure out how many companies do you need to work with, so that when you do, open this up to everybody else, it's more than just say you and Maersk, right? And that was probably our biggest mistake.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Is there anything that you could maybe share with our, especially corporate attendees here, who maybe have not started their blockchain journey, what an easy transition into this new technology might be?
Oh, well, it's almost impossible to ask me that question and have me not tell you to look at Trust Your Supplier, because, but I'll give you an example, right? We talked about this with Walmart, and the chief procurement officer is very excited about it. The chief technology officer, who was already, knee deep in food trust, said, I don't want another major project like this, right? And we said, well, no, wait a second. This is not another major project. This is a solution. And to be perfectly honest, when I present it to potential joiners of the network as buyers, I go through the entire presentation without one blockchain chart. And I almost force them to ask me, well, where's the blockchain, right? Because, and then I tell them why this is only possible with blockchain, because no supplier is going to trust one big centralized database that they don't have any control over, with all of their key information. That is what people decide whether or not I'm going to do business with them, or whether or not I'm going to award them this bid. If somebody hacks into that database and modifies their data, right, with nefarious intent, then that could be a major problem for them. They could lose a major bid until that was discovered as the reason why, right? So I would say look for a blockchain network that exists that you can join and just utilize the technology to your benefit, because it solves a business problem that you already have.
Got it. We have a couple of additional questions in the Q&A. So if you have some extra minutes after we wrapped up in just a second, it would be fantastic if you could just type any questions that our audience has. If there are any additional ones, would it be okay if our audience reaches out to you personally? If so, what would be the best medium to do so?
There is my, I just lost it. It's sjrogers@us.ibm.com. My phone number was also up there, but that's not very useful anymore, since you can't go into the office and answer your phone. So I would suggest using my email, and obviously the presentation, I assume that you'll distribute it, and that chart is in the presentation with my email address in it.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much again, Stephen. That's all the time we have for questions today. It's been a true pleasure. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, Harvey Williams, Senior Associate at Plug and Play Ventures, to take it over from here.
Thank you very much, Frederick. And thank you again, Stephen. So now we are going to move into the startup portion of today's webinar. I'm really delighted to to bring on 4 incredible portfolio companies in the blockchain space for plug and play. Data Gumbo has raised close to $10 million. They built a massively interconnected industrial blockchain network of companies, customers, suppliers, vendors, and they are integrating specific commercial transactional data with automated smart contracts. Their current target industries include oil and gas, construction, mining, manufacturing, and other heavy industries. So I'm delighted to welcome Andrew Bruce. He's the founder and CEO up onto the virtual stage. So hello, Andrew. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Perfect. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning. I'm great. How are you?
Oh, good. So if we could maybe just dive in really quickly, just a personal background, and then why don't we go ahead and start to explain what exactly it is that Data Gumbo does.
Sure. I'm from the Isle of Man, which most people probably have not heard of. Famous for tax evasion and motorcycle racing in the UK. Came to America to study computer science, got a computer science degree from Worcester Polytechnic Institute, Massachusetts. Moved to Texas from a circuitous route. Got involved in the drilling business, oil and gas drilling. During that process, got involved in building autonomous controls with Draper Labs in Boston, looking for specific data that we need to. We're basically using autonomous flight from the space program and adopting it to the oil and gas business, and then realize the need for data that you can aggregate into a seamless IoT platform, which is why we call Data Gumbo. You take a whole bunch of data, put it in a pot, stir it up, make it taste good, you get Data Gumbo. And in the process of selling that, realize that you can use that data as a basis for confirming blockchain transactions. So, and blockchain solved, as we just heard, very specific commercial applications for industry. So started marrying the IoT with the blockchain to deliver commercial value to industrial customers. So very quickly, that's who I am, and quickly how we got to where we are.
And so if you could explain kind of the workflow streams, how does it work?
Well, I think I'm glad to hear the guy from IBM talking about a blockchain network, because that's exactly how it works. You find a network, in our case, we're a network. So if company X, let's say you want to do business with Equinor, it's public, they're an investor of ours, and you are a vendor to them. You would agree on what contracts that you would like to automate with them. You agree what data you're going to use as a trusted source of data. You would write a smart contract to encode the executable terms of the contract. In other words, was sand delivered, yes or no? Was water delivered, yes or no? What's the price of the delivery? And then you would connect to the IoT sensors in the field to confirm that delivery has happened. And you would use that as a triggering event to create a new block, which creates a new charge. And then you would either do an ACH payment between the participants, or you would use the existing ERP process to initiate the process.
And so what is the hard problem, or I'm sure there's several, what are some of the hard problems that Data Gumbo is solving in that chain of events?
Are you asking about specific use cases, or you're asking about just the hard parts of the actual solution?
I suppose the specific, in that specific use case, is the hard part more on the IoT side? Is it more on the business adaption side? Is it more on
it's always
blockchain side?
It's always change management.
Yep.
So there's a huge corporate infrastructure built to support the existing systems that are in place that were put there 20, 30 years ago. And just for the case of water haulage, there's a public press release that came out recently, what we did for the blockchain consortium. They've got a 31-step manual process for validating field tickets, measuring how much water was taken, creating invoices, reconciling invoices, agreeing, disagreeing, the whole process, and then actually getting the transaction into the SAP system. is an incredibly manual process, which is fraught with delay and opportunities for contract leakage. And changing that to an automated process where it's very much like going to a gas station, you swipe your credit card, you pump your gas, and you leave. In this case, you pick up the water, you deliver the water, and you get paid. So you completely collapse the payment cycle and payment process. The internal processes within the corporations are slow and inefficient and are ripe for change. And the biggest challenge is enabling that change. So part of the testing is people are saying, well, what do I do? I'm like, actually nothing, because it's all been automated. So, somebody said, I don't like being an invoice engineer. I want to go back to being a drilling engineer. So they can go back to doing value-added jobs as opposed to just pushing paper. And so
I was reading up on that Reuters article, and some of the ROI metrics that you guys had been able to prove out was you reduced a workflow stream that previously took somewhere from 90 days to potentially 120 days down to within a week.
Or daily now. Yeah, there's no reason why you can't just say, okay, delivery was made, make a payment. There's no reason why it has to be daily. The only reason it would be daily is internal processes within the companies, but there's no technical reason why it can't be immediate.
And this is applicable not only to just oil and gas, but you're also pursuing heavy industry, industrial segments more generally.
Absolutely, yeah. It could be capital projects. It could be mining. We're working on mining projects. We're working on marine projects. We're working on, we've been asked to look at fish farming. We've been asked to look at organic bug farms. So yeah, as long as you've got a digital source of data that can be used to confirm the execution or the trigger of the terms of the contract, then there's no reason why you can't do it.
And on the IoT integration side, is that something that you guys are also helping your customers with, or is that something that you ask your customers to bring to the table?
That's actually a really good question. I'm going to answer your question. I'm going to answer a second question, which I presume you're going to ask. So we have standard APIs that we use so that we standardize the data that we bring in. That's, we use the IoT platform. It's fully encrypted so that there is protection of the data from the moment it is touched all the way through the execution of the contract. And then smart contracts, those can be written by anyone. So it can be written by us, it can be written by our customers. So a lot of our customers are training up their employees to write their smart contracts. It could be written by consulting companies. So we're talking to some of the major consulting companies about them writing the smart contracts. So the marriage of the IoT and the smart contracts is the secret sauce, if you like. And but they can be written by anyone.
Sure. So what, we only have time for maybe one more question. When you look ahead to the rest of 2020 and kind of the traction that you guys are making in the oil and gas space, what does the next 6 months, 9 months look for Data Gumbo?
Well, it's the whole idea of touchless transactions with the COVID virus, and then we got the crash in the oil price. Both of those have been good for us, ironically, because people have got to reduce their OPEX costs, and you can only lay off so many people. There's been hundreds of thousands of people laid off, and that's where technology comes in and makes things more efficient. So you're able to drive, I think in that press release it says 25% of the cost out of the transactional cost of delivering wastewater or picking up wastewater. So we're seeing more and more adoption of blockchain, and now that the blockchain consortium project has been publicly announced a success, there's a lot of people getting on board saying, okay, I need to get on board with this and see how we can take advantage of the technology.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Andrew, for joining us. We really appreciate your time. How can people get in touch with Data Gumbo?
You can send an email to sales@datagumbo.com. You can email me, Andrew@datagumbo.com. And that's the best way.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. And
appreciate it.
Enjoying Houston in the barbecue down there.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing you soon.
Likewise. Bye, Andrew.
Bye-bye.
Okay. So next up, I would like to welcome Bex 360. They focus on supply chains such as coffee, seafood, timber, minerals, cotton, and palm oil to provide a traceable fingerprint from producer to consumer. And they're also providing payments to farmers up front. So I'd like to welcome Dan Jones. He is the founder and CEO of BEX 360 to the stage. How are you, Dan?
Good to see you, Harvey.
Likewise. Where are you in the world right now?
I'm just outside of Denver, up in Golden, Colorado. That's where the company's headquartered.
Excellent.
So unfortunately, we miss traveling for sure.
Oh, I know. Hopefully we'll be able to do this in person soon. So if you could give the audience just, a quick background. I mean, you've got a really unique story, spending quite a bit of time in the DRC, and I think it'd be great to just introduce the audience to kind of your past experiences.
Sure. My background is in applied mathematics, and I have an MBA in international finance and really working in the developing world. I've been 15 of the last 20 years I've spent living and working in the developing world, from India to China. And then the ideas, excuse me, around BEX 360 really came from my time in Congo. We were the first company to export conflict-free minerals directly from the Congo to the US. So a lot of these technologies that we developed were based upon my experience. I think the gentleman from IBM mentioned, the guns being drawn. That was us in Congo exporting coltan, not cobalt, but directly to the US market. So we saw changes on the ground. What I saw were changes on the ground to digitize supply chains, and also just a huge environmental issue with these supply chains being verticalized into these developing zones.
So when we first got to know each other a few years ago, you were really focused on coffee and coffee cherries. So could you kind of walk us through, what does BEX 360 do today, and how has that journey kind of evolved?
Yeah, we started in coffee because we thought it was something that consumers could relate to as compared to coltan. So we developed systems to collect data from origin and then deliver that to the retail level so people can have an idea of where their products came from, and importantly, that the suppliers of those goods can have information about where their product ends up. I think that's a big piece that's missing in a lot of solutions, is that the supplier of these goods are treated like they are not worthy of being part of these supply chains, when really they are the critical part. So that's why we started in coffee. And since we've just developed a platform, you can think of us as a SaaS platform that provides traceability, that proves origin, authenticity, and sustainability. And really the important factor that we're working on is providing the finance down these supply chains. I like to say that the producers have the land and the labor. If they had the capital, they could more fairly integrate into the global supply chains. And there's a $4 trillion gap in those supply chain financing that the blockchain really helps solve over the long term to help finance get to these producers.
And you had started out with the BEX machine, which maybe not everyone knows or is familiar with it. Could you maybe explain and kind of describe your journey when you got started with the BEX machine and kind of where you are today?
Sure, yeah, we've been at this for a while, so it's been 4 or 5 years, and we made what we call a BEX machine that analyzes coffee, and we use it for cocoa now and vanilla, anything about that size in the developing world. Primarily, it allows people to analyze their product at that first mile. So you can think of it as a very complex IoT device, but it does AI on the cherries themselves, so we can give feedback to the producers about the quality they're producing. And then it instantaneously turns that into a crypto asset for them. So we take the coffee and we turn it into 3 batches, for example, one that has a rating of 90, one that has 85, and one that has a rating of 79, which those are kind of just like wine is graded. It allows for the kind of the decommoditization of that product, so that the producer can get the biggest benefit from their crops instead of just passing it on to one of these giant traders that really is not providing any value other than the capital itself.
Understood. And you've recently actually moved into, maybe not recently, but more recently, you moved into cotton and had a pretty big success recently with PVH and being able to trace the components of that cotton through the supply chain. So would love to kind of peel that back. I mean, can you kind of explain how you got into cotton in the first place, and then walk us through that project with PVH?
Yeah, I guess we could say we're kind of pulled into cotton through Fashion for Good. We're a scaling partner with the Fashion for Good initiative out of Amsterdam. They've been great. So our partners there are Kering, Gucci, and Zalando, which is probably the biggest company that no one's heard of in the world. And what we did was we tracked organic cotton from source all the way through garments. And really the underlying important piece about that is not just the traceability, but the ability to embed markers in those products. So we track different marking technologies, whether they be microbiomes or isotopes or fluorescence, synthetic DNA, all different ways of either inherent markers being part of it or us applying a marker or utilizing standard inventory tools like RFID to see if we can increase the transparency of a supply chain without as much data collection at every node.
And for cotton, I mean, so you were adding a biomarker of some sort to the actual raw product, the raw commodity. And then even after processing, distribution, it still held true that you were able to identify that this biomarker was unique and it didn't get messed up in the process.
Correct, that's what we were measuring. And so there were biomarkers like isotopes and microbiomes that were inherent in the cotton. And there are other ones that you're referring to, which are fluorescent markers and synthetic DNA, which survived those processes all the way through to the point where our partners and I could scan a shirt in the CNA stores in Amsterdam and prove that it had those markers. And our platform enabled the link all the way back to the individual collections we made from every farm in India.
That's really neat. So what does that look like at scale? I mean, as you talk to the partners about, you know, where do you go from here? You've proven that it works. What does this look like at scale?
It looks very similar to what we did. We're now scaling in coffee and cocoa and essential oils, and I would say you're scaling it in palm oil, but the process looks very similar, where we train the trainers on how to collect these commodities. And much similar to the previous speakers, the reason companies are doing that is because it saves them money, right? In the developing world, typically they take 1 out of 7 days just to pay their suppliers. So it's not a good process for either one of them. And so we enable those digital payments. And so we're getting this, you know, in kind of SaaS terminology, it's kind of a land and expand strategy where we get, once we've tracked commodities up to Whole Foods, for example, in the palm oil case, we then get the palm oil producer themselves saying, wow, this has really saved us a lot of transaction costs. It's adding value to our producers. And now we're starting to bring on that middle tier producer and even some cooperatives globally.
And on the blockchain side, are you guys still working on development in the background alongside trying to do the change management piece and the use cases and identify those business cases? Is there also kind of a continuous improvement in the development side?
For sure. I mean, you know us, we're a technology first type of a startup. So we're blockchain agnostic. Our primary partner is Stellar. We're continuing to work with stellar.org to develop anchors, to do cross-currency transactions, cross-commodity transactions, currency to crypto to commodity. Those types of developments are going on in the background because we really are now pushing loans down, not pushing, I guess, enabling loans down these supply chains using the blockchain as a facilitator to make that more efficient. So all of that work is ongoing. And then just adhering to the standards. We're GS1 compliant now, we're GDPR, we've tracked cocoa, for example, from Togo and Ghana, all GDPR compliant through 16 different nodes, all the way to tens of thousands of products in individual stores in Italy.
I know we have maybe time for one more question. What are some other target-rich industries for you? You've looked at seafood and timber. You know, what's next in terms of a scalable target market?
Yeah, we'd love, everyone's trying to do seafood, I guess. We're just going where, we're a little bit opportunistic about where we go. Recently, we've done a lot of work in PPE. There's been a lot, I think other people have talked about it during this webinar, is that there's a lot of fraud in those documents and the underlying products that go into those products. So think of cotton going into PPE. So that's an area that we've really started to expand upon. And then the other piece is marketplaces. We've just had such a strong pull to say no one out there is really providing marketplaces that have all sustainable goods in them. And so we've created 3 marketplaces now, one for PPE, one for honey, and the third one I can't discuss, but they're all huge markets. So we get more into that, Amazon type margins for transactions, and we can white label that solution for our partners as well.
Understood. Well, Dan, we're out of time, but always a pleasure chatting with you, sir.
All right. See you soon, Harvey. Thanks.
Take care. Okay, next up, I would like to welcome Circulor. They provide traceability as a service to verify responsible sourcing, to underpin effective recycling, and to reliably give a commodity an identity and to track that from source to consumption. So they help reach parts of OEM supply chains that most companies currently don't have that much visibility into. So Doug, good morning, and how are you?
Very well, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm following Brexit's lead by putting a branded top on. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely, yeah. I wish I had one on as well. Stuck in the button up. But Doug, if you could, let's open it up. I'd like to kind of keep things along a similar structure. So a quick background about yourself, and then let's dive right into Circulor.
Sure. So an engineer by training, and for the last sort of decade or so, I've been in a variety of sort of digital innovation roles in large corporates, ranging from Barclays Bank to British Telecom. The idea for Circulor as a business came from work 4 years or so ago, looking at some of the challenges around trust in supply chains and a sort of belief that blockchain could potentially unlock them. Obviously, all of that was covered by Stephen earlier in the presentation, so I'm not going to rehash it.
And so if you could explain what Circulor does.
We do. Yeah, so we focus on complex industrial supply chains where materials change between their origin and their consumption. And we started with tracking the provenance of materials like cobalt, we talked about by the last speaker, into electric vehicle batteries. We have customers such as Daimler and Volvo Cars for whom we're doing that now. And having been able to create a digital thread that demonstrates the change, the chemical composition change and the amalgamation of materials with others, because obviously ore from a mine site is nothing like a car, we've actually started to build on that chain of custody of materials for things like carbon tracking. So a dynamic attribution of greenhouse gas emissions to the steps along the supply chain. Why? If you look at the auto industry, if you look at a whole variety of heavy industries, they're adopting net zero targets mostly in the late 2030s to 2040. And that starts with needing to have a far more sophisticated view of the supply chain's contribution to carbon footprint. So obviously we're doing provenance, but that process of provenance actually allows you to do other things on top, such as carbon tracking. Our two main markets at the moment are the auto industry, primarily focused around electric vehicle batteries, and the other one that we've now been working on actively for a while is the traceability of the chemical recycling of plastic waste. We all know about plastic in oceans. The challenge is that the majority of recycling today is mechanical recycling, which means most of it ends up in construction materials. Chemical recycling means sending the waste plastic back to the same oil refineries that did the black stuff that came out of the ground, and turning it back into all the products that come from crude oil. And the reason why traceability is so important there is because a number of countries, particularly around the EU, are introducing plastic taxes so that, someone like Coca-Cola who is putting plastic bottles onto the market will have to demonstrate that a minimum of 30% of that plastic comes from recycled sources. Currently, the capability to do that doesn't exist, so it's a sizable problem. And it fits with the features that I mentioned earlier of following an industrial raw material through industrial processes.
And for Volvo, if I'm not mistaken, you're also tracking the recycled cobalt.
Correct. So we've got scrap, both freshly mined materials as well as scrap lithium-ion batteries. And that's the start, of course, trying to plot a circular economy for batteries. Clearly, at the end of life, imagine 7 years that you've had the battery inside your Tesla, at the end of its useful life in a car, there's the potential for a second life in things like energy storage systems, but also the potential for the refurbishment or recycling of those batteries. Clearly, we're going to move towards a position where there's a strategic competition for scarce resources like lithium and cobalt and others necessary for lithium-ion batteries. But the circular economy is something that is in its infancy, and yet a number of people are working on elements of it. It needs an information or a technology backbone to enable that circular economy.
So for the greenhouse emissions use case with Daimler, can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on that? How are you tracking it?
Yeah, so let's start off with, why a dynamic approach might be better than what happens today. So supply chains obviously are not chains, they're networks. They involve multiple participants at every step of the supply chain. And the flow of materials is obviously not linear. And so at any point in time, there might be 2 or 3 different tier 3 or 4 suppliers that are contributing a proportion of raw material to what eventually finds its way into a battery for a Mercedes-Benz car, for example. And some of those will be using renewable energy, some of those mid-tier suppliers, some will be using coal-fired electricity, and clearly each of those will therefore contribute a completely different amount of embedded carbon to the eventual product. The challenge of the status quo today is that the majority of, say, car manufacturers are using life cycle assessments, scope 3 life cycle assessments, carbon life cycle assessments, to try and understand the carbon footprint. Those LCAs are built on sort of industry benchmark data, and they are relatively generic, no matter, and there are also different methodologies for doing it. So the work with Daimler was coming up with an approach to the dynamic attribution of slices of the carbon footprint depending upon the flow of materials through the supply chain. And it's the first time it's been done. And the reason it's important is because what it equips someone like Daimler to do now is engage in a conversation with their supply chain about how to balance price, quality, and sustainability measures in how to make their purchasing decisions. If by paying a tiny bit more, you can get material that's coming from someone who's using renewable energy sources and materially impact the carbon footprint of your battery, which accounts for about 50% of the total carbon cost of an electric vehicle. That's worth doing, because you'd have to spend far more than that finding other ways to reduce the carbon footprint. But without the sort of dynamic attribution that I talked about, that would be impossible.
And how are you getting access to tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers, and how are you validating those inputs?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, this is a panel about blockchain, and so obviously we're using a blockchain, but it's not only a blockchain. We're using machine learning in here as well, and a variety of other technologies. The question to how we're getting access to those suppliers is that we're following the flow down of obligations from the OEM to their tier 1 supplier, to their tier 1 supplier, to their tier 1 supplier through the supply chain. And in the electric vehicle battery supply chain, because of materials like cobalt and lithium that come with environmental or human rights concerns, there's already a considerable focus on a level of transparency which is not common in most other supply chains yet. However, even when you go all the way upstream to large industrial miners, and we're doing a project at the moment with a very large industrial miner, they recognize that there's a growing market for green aluminium or green nickel, because ultimately their downstream customers are looking to achieve net zero. So we're finding both sides of the supply chain starting to come together around things like net zero.
And moving into 2020, or the back half of 2020 rather, what are some other markets that you're looking at?
Well, I mentioned plastic waste. I bored you with that just now. That's for us, that's a really big focus. It has exactly the same features of material that changes its composition. There are broadly 2 approaches that are being taken in the blockchain space for tracking materials and supply chains. One is the transactions between the participants in the supply chain used as a proxy for a chain of custody of the material. And the alternative approach is giving an actual digital identity to a physical commodity and following that physical commodity on its journey. When you've come up with a way to connect the input ingredients to a process to the output product of that process, and you're capable of doing that at industrial scale across a global supply chain, there are many other supply chains where you can apply that. And plastic waste is the next one that we're focusing on. We think there's real complexity in some of these industrial supply chains, and it's far harder to track materials that change between source and consumption than something like perhaps a gemstone that, albeit uncut and unpolished, still has the same fundamental physical properties at its source as it does at the point it ends up in a piece of jewelry, for example.
Sure. No, you're solving some really interesting and hard problems. So Doug, thank you very much for joining us. We're out of time. How can people get in touch with you?
Very simple, Doug@circular.com. Doug@circular.com.
Thank you very much, Doug. We appreciate your time. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we are moving into our final discussion. This one with VeriTrack. They are a blockchain-based document collaboration and workflow management platform for pharmaceutical supply chains and those companies to communicate sensitive documents and to work together with their customers and their suppliers and partners. So I'd like to welcome Colin to the stage. How are you, Colin?
I'm doing great, Harvey. Thanks for having me. Yeah, how are you?
Good. So we'd love to kick things off. Can you walk us through kind of your background and how VeriTrack got started?
Sure. So my background, I've got about 7 years of experience in healthcare and life sciences technology. Most of that was in the US to start. I moved to the UK about 2 years ago to study at Oxford. And when I was studying there, I met Jason Lacombe, the CEO of VeriTrack, who had started the company a few years before. I joined last summer as the head of product to kind of lead the product development and innovation side of things. And the company was originally founded, as you mentioned in the introduction, to basically help life sciences supply chains collaborate, exchange documents more securely and efficiently.
So because you're the only company that's talking about pharma and healthcare up here today, can you kind of walk us through what is the state of the industry today and kind of how are you guys trying to change that?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting place to be for 2020. It's an industry, not like many others at the moment right now, where it's certainly not going anywhere. We're seeing a lot of changes, particularly on the supply chain side, where quite a bit of consolidation and a lot more remote activities that these companies aren't really used to doing. So it's been really interesting seeing companies adapt to the area of remote working. When it comes to our product, using it for things like auditing their suppliers remotely that they'd normally trust to go do in person. It's been really interesting. So lots of changes going on this part of the year thus far.
And so can you kind of give us the 30,000 foot view for the product itself? Who's actually an operator of the product and how does it work?
Sure. So we sell the product as a software as a service to life sciences companies or their contracted outsourced supply chain partners. So that might be a contract manufacturer or a packaging organization. We sell the software to them on a per license basis. They invite their supply chain partners on, and basically our platform serves to take all the communication that they're doing over email or fax or the post or attaching things to orders and hard copies and putting that all into our secure platform. So we're sort of this hybrid mix of a project management tool where we have workflows that build in the proper steps for a product and how things should be exchanged and reviewed. And we offer electronic signatures on documents within the product. So that's sort of with a hybrid with this sort of file storage, file exchange. Where the blockchain comes into play is we take every transaction that's done on the platform and store that in a hashing method, store the fingerprint of that hash on chain. And that's really kind of a differentiator for us and something that gives our customers a lot of confidence in this industry, because in the event of recalls or audits, they get this sort of transparency and visibility across, what did all the supply chain partners do in handling and signing and reviewing, the documents and data that came onto the platform. So that's about the 30,000 foot level. Yeah.
And so what are some of the features for VeriTrack that your customers continue to appreciate? Is it speed, trust, as you had mentioned, obviously, but what are some of those things that you're doing on the product side that's making this product very sticky?
Yeah, I think the stickiness has to do with not necessarily a feature, but the ease of implementation and onboarding, and kind of the network effect that we're hoping to achieve. Once you get a few of the suppliers and manufacturers on, we're hoping to be sort of the product of choice for the way these things are exchanged. And once you're exchanging documents on VeriTrack with one of your customers, you can just log on and toggle easily to work with a different customer with the same login. I think one of the big things that's helping a lot right now seems trivial in 2020, but really is the electronic signatures. Pharma and life sciences is really behind a lot of other industries and exchanging documents and signing them. Mostly still wet signatures and scanning and uploading these things. So we work really hard to make that compliant and save a lot of time and paper, having an electronic signature feature within the product. When that's done, the next kind of player in the workflow is notified. And so we're just cutting these gaps between, back and forth that's going on over email, and trying to help them become a bit more efficient working, outside their four walls.
Have any of your companies had a recall or anything to that effect?
Not that I've known, since they've been customers of ours, but we get into conversations with a lot of companies because they've had a recall and they understand the importance and the difficulty in stringing together different events across different platforms, asking their supplier what they did, kind of trusting at an arm's length that the supplier is being honest. So, data integrity and handling GXP documents is something really at the core of what we do. And so that trust, that kind of ironclad audit trail that we provide, across end to end, really brings a lot of interest to the table.
And I would assume pharma, food, of course, but those are probably two of the bigger impact, industries where those are necessary factors, right? The trust of it. So what are some other quirks that you can share with us about the pharmaceutical supply chain or the pharmaceutical industry that you think is probably a little different from some other industries?
Sure. I guess one thing that's becoming really interesting right now and a lot of focus in 2020 is there's a shift in mindset. I think in this industry, there's definitely a perception of big bad pharma companies, and there's a shift in mindset in them focusing their innovation R&D efforts into more important medicines rather than the most profitable ones. And so I think there's definitely a shift in mindset across the supply chain towards what are the more important medicines that we should be making and how do we deliver those faster. So efficiency is becoming really something that every player is looking at, as a packager. How do you win more business by being more efficient? Companies are starting to pump more money into cell and gene therapies, which are really tight supply chains. And if that's an inefficient process, then people die. And you've made the investment into, a really costly therapy or vaccine. And then if you can't get it to the patient on time, that's seen as a pretty big flaw. So I think there's definitely a big shift into making the supply chain more faster and more efficient, trying to catch up with like FMCG and industries that do that a little bit better.
So I think we're out of time. Last question here, though, with all that's swirling around with COVID, do you think that there are some things that are going to be now more permanent, as a result of the changes of COVID-19 on your industry? And if you think that's true, what does the rest of 2020 kind of look like for you guys?
Yeah, I think there's definitely shifts at like a macro level on where production and where these things are going to change. There's a lot of talk of geographic changes of where the supply chain is going to shift, whether that's, a little bit more towards the United States or more towards Europe, and away from parts like Asia. But I think being able to, in the supply chain, be able to manufacture and produce safely and efficiently is just going to be a huge selling point. And I think you'll probably start to see a bit more consolidation of those kinds of companies. If they do it, they'll kind of back their strengths and maybe buy additional sites. And just the challenge and the focus of maintaining quality of the medicines while people are in different places and unable to monitor things to make sure that medicines are, meeting all the right quality standards and, being manufactured properly.
Excellent. Well, Colin, I know you're certainly in the thick of it, so appreciate any time that you could spare to chat with us. So thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Harvey. Really appreciate it.
Take care.
Bye.
Okay. So next up, we are going to hear from 3 spectacular panelists. I'd like to first introduce Nadia Hewitt. She's the project lead in blockchain and data for common purpose at the World Economic Forum. She's based in San Francisco, where the forum focuses on Industry 4.0 technologies, including blockchain, AI, Internet of Things, autonomous driving, precision medicine, and others. In 2020, her team at the forum published the Redesigning Trust Blockchain Deployment Toolkit, which is the gold standard in blockchain deployment. So welcome, Nadia. How are you?
Good. Thank you for having me, Harvey.
Thank you for joining. Next, I'd like to introduce Anthony DiPrinzio. He's currently the blockchain ecosystem manager for BASF's digital innovation team, where he is responsible for designing the BASF Blockchain Lab. Prior to that, Anthony was a strategic growth associate for XSpring, which is an initiative by Ripple that builds infrastructure and helps innovative projects by leveraging open source protocols. Anthony, how are you? Good morning.
Good. Good. How are you?
And finally, I'd like to introduce Adrian Muhletaler. He has been with Swiss Post since the beginning of this year as a senior product manager for new business models on the blockchain. And prior to that, he spent quite a bit of time with Swisscom, where both Swiss Post and Swisscom are working on a consortium blockchain infrastructure together called Swiss Trust Chain. So Adrian, good morning and welcome.
Hi, everyone.
So perhaps, we can just go around the room pretty quickly. Would love to just hear a little bit more from you and what you're working on today. I gave a kind of a quick overview, but I think it'd be really interesting to talk about some specific projects that each of you are working on today. So why don't we start with you, Nadia?
Yes, sure. So I'm with the World Economic Forum, and we really focus on intersection between public and private sector. I'm with the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution in San Francisco. So we really look at blockchain through the lens of 4IR technology. So with AI, with IoT, etc. Our projects focus mainly on governance gaps. So we want to make sure that the technology accelerates for the use of all, that it's inclusive, but there are still barriers today, governance barriers, so regulation, principles, standardization, and things like that. And we partner with governments around the world, we partner with private sectors around the world in many different projects and industries to help remove some of these barriers. And in supply chain, one example of that is a blockchain deployment toolkit that we published last month. And that toolkit then incorporates best practices, insights, frameworks, checklists, references that supply chain organizations can use to help with blockchain deployment. So that way, giving them impartial information, which removes one of the barriers, which was hype and a lack of education, as one example of practical products that we work on.
Thank you, Nadia. Anthony, why don't you go next?
Sure. So at BASF, we're working on a number of interesting projects that are leveraging blockchain in addition to a few other new and innovative technologies. I think that was something interesting that I observed from watching the few startups that presented earlier, was that they're sort of using blockchain as just one layer of some of these more complex projects. So sort of operating on the same page there. And in particular, we're doing a lot of projects around sustainability initiatives. And then we're also working on projects involved with some new work that we're looking into around like autonomous IoT supply chain related use cases. So I would say that's the bulk of where we're sort of exploring right now. It's also great to have the BASF Blockchain Lab because we're constantly sourcing new projects and ideas from our colleagues. And so every day there's always sort of new ideas that are coming into the forefront. So really excited to see if there's anything else we could be working on in the future.
And on the sustainability front, I mean, definitely possible opportunities with Circular and what Doug is building.
Yeah, definitely. One project in particular is actually focused on the recycling of plastics. So I think it's very related to what Circular is working on.
Excellent. So Adrian, we'll kind of wrap it up with you before we dive into some more of the panel-like discussions.
Yeah, we are having two main topics. One is our network trust chain you already introduced. That's more or less a consortium blockchain infrastructure. We're calling it as well consensus as a service, where we're operating internal cases and partner cases. The second approach is we're looking for new business models based on blockchain together with partners, mostly in Switzerland.
Excellent. So Nadia, why don't we jump right into it with you to begin? You know, many early blockchain projects either never made it out of proof of concept or they failed immediately afterwards. And I think Stephen Rogers even mentioned that in his presentation, where companies are now starting to look beyond the POC stage. So in your opinion, you know, what's happening there?
Yes, okay. So a very good question, because the last 2-3 years, especially in blockchain and in supply chain and logistics, there's been a lot of proof of concepts and exploration. We've seen with COVID that, you know, servicing all the system issues, interoperability, integrity, resilience, and all of that, that there's really been also some new momentum around the potential of distributed ledger technology to solve some of supply chain issues, right? So if you think about blockchain technology, it enables a shared truth. So what you see is what I see. And when you look at a lot of the issues we've seen with COVID, which are really not new issues in supply chain, we saw those issues with when there's strikes on the West Coast or port strikes, or whether you talk about E. coli or SARS or any other disruptions, that at the end of the day, we need that shared truth, right? Otherwise there's breakdowns and blind spots. And if you think about COVID specifically and other related type of epidemics where the provenance of food quality, livestock issues, those things, so the provenance of products has an important role to play as well in pandemics and endemics. So we've actually, at the World Economic Forum, sitting across governments and private sector, we've seen a lot of momentum again, where people are sort of looking at old proof of concepts and saying, well, this time we are seriously going to solve this. In terms of POCs failing, what we also see at the forum is a lot of proof of concepts are one or two parties doing blockchain experimentation. And if you really understand the benefits of blockchain, when you can prove value, it's when you take a multi-stakeholder approach. So when you invite bigger networks, right? The blockchain is the ultimate network technology. So if you think you're going to get a lot of value by just doing it in your own four walls, the proof of value is not then there. So the difficult thing with proof of concepts is how do you take it industry-wide? And that is where you have to work with your competitors, the person or the guy next door you might not necessarily like. And I think companies, that requires the paradigm shift. How do you work with your competitors? And that's where questions on governance, and I'm not talking about platform governance, I'm talking about governance around working in ecosystems, who pays, who gets the value, how do you distribute value fairly? Like those questions then becomes very important. And that is new. And it's great that blockchain are opening the door to those type of discussions, that you work with broader players within your ecosystem.
And Anthony, I mean, as BASF, you guys have been involved in blockchain for quite some time. What are some of the things that you're seeing from within the organization as it relates to POCs? I mean, you had mentioned you're working on a couple projects now. How does BASF and the industry kind of continue to push things towards a commercial application?
Right, that's a really good question. I was just going to echo off of what Nadia said about exploring use cases that are only within like your company's four walls. I think this is something, when I joined BASF and people would come to me with different blockchain ideas, it seemed to be a recurring theme. And I would sort of have to tell people, hey, you're sort of thinking about the technology in not necessarily the right lens, because like Nadia mentioned, I think the true value of blockchain is actually being able to interact with different organizations, which I like to call frenemies. And the reason I say that is because in some scenarios, in some scenarios, they're a customer to us, right? And then in other scenarios, we're actually competing to sell different products. So it's a very interesting relationship that we have with a lot of our customers and suppliers. And so by being able to use blockchain technology, it really allows you to sort of create this cross collaboration and sort of innovate in a more rapid and agile way that we haven't really seen before. So I think that's one thing I wanted to mention. In terms of moving from proof of concept projects, so I would say before I joined BASF, most of what we worked on was, just proof of concept projects. And I think the main thing we took away from, okay, why isn't this maybe scaling to pilots, or what could we be doing differently, is to actually see how can we contribute to sort of like the open source realm. So, I'm coming from I think a bit of a different mindset than maybe some people at BASF, just considering that I recently graduated from UC Berkeley and was really entrenched in the crypto space out in Silicon Valley. And so my sort of approach to getting past the proof of concept phase is to really start to think, okay, what are the strategic startups in the space that are sort of building the core infrastructure for blockchain? So looking at layer 1 protocols, layer 2 tooling and infrastructure, privacy preserving components, right? How can we strategically work with those people, help them develop their products, and sort of provide our insights as a potential user of these technologies, so we can create a really robust software stack to help advance the technology and start to really actually pilot a lot of these projects. So I think that's a unique approach that we've sort of taken at BASF, is just really figuring out, okay, how can we plug into the more open source realm?
And Adrian, something that we talked about recently is kind of how you're trying to build a community or a network for SMBs. So would love to learn a little bit more about that project that you're working on. And actually a question from the audience here, I'll tee up, is, what are some of the pros and cons from having a kind of a government-sponsored organization driving that change?
I think well, it's not just one, it's two companies. It's the Swiss Post and it's Swisscom. So it's two main corporates in Swisscom in Switzerland. We are both partially owned by the government. And so that, I believe, that brings a lot of trust into the system. And especially if you look at a small country like Switzerland, it's not the most powerful country in the world, so it's not so easy to push around the use cases you having on there. So, so I think through this brand, through the network we're operating as a consortium blockchain infrastructure, enabling a lot of smaller companies to make a quick step into the technology and leveraging the potential into their digital experiences. And then as well, we have quite a big footprint into the economy and to the companies based in Switzerland. So we can bring together these various companies to solve problems together.
And Nadia, you're very very well positioned between the public and private sectors when you're looking at blockchain kind of as a whole. What is required from both sides in order to increase the widespread adoption and kind of accelerate development?
Yes, so from where I'm sitting and seeing what many regulators are working on, they are very active in the proof of concept and engaging private sector. So I always say to startups, to private sector companies who start working on building solutions together, that they really need to intentionally think about how and when they invite regulators, governments into that. There is no reason, in fact, in many instances, it will actually accelerate and strengthen the solution they're building on if they can include regulators, government bodies, government entities, again, depending on the use case, into that effort. and I also think it's part of the strong case for decentralized technologies. If you think about it, governments today need to, in many instances within supply chains, prove different things. An example could be they need to prove that this certificate of origin or certification related to the imports of goods really comes from country X or country Y. They need to prove that raw material from automotives, vehicles, right? Raw material recalls, right? Governments gets very involved in that. And it's not unlikely to imagine a world where governments might not be that satisfied any longer with centralized proof, you know, that some recall has happened. So there's definitely a subtle move when you talk about sustainable sourcing, responsible sourcing, again, as it relates to supply chains, to the power of more parties being able to verify the truth. And if you then go back to what distributed ledger technology offers you, you can see that regulators will more and more start to look at that, right, as a source of truth versus trusting that's centralized. So I think that also really provides a strong reason and a compelling reason for companies to not stay on the sidelines when it comes to blockchain technology, because they are going to see increasing pressure from governments, regulators, investors, employees, customers to verify and authenticate. And blockchain is not the silver bullet, but it can play a very important role and has unique features, right, that positions it as a compelling technology.
And just quickly, I wanted to, if I may, just comment on that as well. So I think what Nadia just mentioned actually is sort of BASF's thinking, especially for our sustainability related projects, because when you're building out these use cases and projects, right, the direct impact we're having isn't just on, okay, you know, these B2B players, right? We're actually impacting the society at large. And so if we want to really go out there and tell the larger community that, hey, look, you don't have to just trust us or a government where some people might have some sort of reservations behind that just because of maybe historical issues people have seen with maybe corruption or maybe figures that weren't necessarily spot on. Now we can say, hey, you don't have to trust us. You can actually put your trust in this system where literally all of the parties are coming together and providing the requisite information from their you know, role within this value chain to actually prove that these numbers that we're putting out or these measures are truly what we say they are. So I definitely agree and think that's super important.
And I want to pull on that thread a little more because I think that ties in with a point that you made earlier, Anthony, which is a lot of companies have complex relationships when someone might be a supplier in one instance, but a competitor in another product. So, you know, how has blockchain kind of shifted that landscape for data management and data sharing between buyers and suppliers? And Nadia, a point that you made when we chatted earlier was, you know, how can you accelerate that across borders as well? So Anthony, let's start with you, and then I'd love to hear from each of you.
Yeah, so I think the question of data and being able to actually share that across different parties is a really important thing to be talking about. And like I said before, I think we're seeing more and more today the openness and willingness of these different stakeholders to actually be sharing certain information. One thing that we have come across is, although people are open to these ideas, there are certain scenarios where specific data that we might need or require is not necessarily, people don't necessarily have the willingness to share everything just because some of that information might be proprietary to their business or, you know, it's critical to whatever their product is. And, you know, I totally understand that, right? And BASF is in the same boat with a lot of information that we have. And so trying to look at solutions that can help us sort of provide the right metadata that can still get us to where we need to go without fully exposing everything that a company sort of has behind their own four walls is something to really take into consideration. And when you think about blockchain, right, people always say, oh, well, if I'm recording everything on the blockchain, then really I might be pseudonymous, but I'm not fully anonymous, and like you can still sort of make certain inferences and such from data. So we've put a heavy focus on looking at different like privacy preserving protocols. And this is something that a lot of people are exploring right now. If you look in the space, there's a lot of venture funds that are specifically focused on investing in projects looking at privacy. There's a lot of work being done at the university level. Just as an example, we worked with a project called Oasis Labs, which was started by a professor out of UC Berkeley named Dawn Song, building trusted execution environments using like Intel's SGX technology. And this goes back to that comment that I mentioned earlier about, okay, how can we as an organization, as an enterprise company, actually contribute to improving some of these technologies? And so we worked very closely with Oasis Labs on a specific use case. And in that process, they were actually able to develop and tailor their solution based on the feedback we were providing them, saying like, hey, we're willing to share this information, but not this. However, we need to get like X outcome. What can we be doing with your platform to sort of ensure that that happens? And so I think that was a really critical relationship to help sort of move forward and like you were talking about, accelerate the expansion of being able to incorporate data into these blockchain platforms and still be able to share it while having everybody sort of happy.
And Nadia, something that you had mentioned is not necessarily a new focus, but an intense focus from the WEF on data. So would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so just also then to add on to that, technically from the technical side, there shouldn't be hesitation to share data. There's, like Anthony mentioned, privacy preserving technology. There's a lot of innovation happening in the space. In fact, blockchain in many ways can be an enabler, right? When you talk about preserving privacy, it's absolutely important, right, to pay attention to personal handling in addition to your confidentiality concerns, like personal data handling regulation like GDPR, etc. Right? Those things are extremely important. But again, it's not the technical side that's the problem. It's having compliance, building it, having data sharing agreements in place that is compliant. The challenge is, the core challenge with blockchain is on the operational side and the willingness of companies to work together. If you look at logistics and supply chain, I think a lot of the hesitation, and when you hear people say, oh, but you know, it's confidential, we don't want to, I think it's, if you really go layers down, it doesn't so much have to do with the, really the concern being, oh, my confidential data is going to be risked if I go on blockchain. It's more to do with the will of companies and countries. If you see COVID now, countries, the willingness of countries to share data. I think many of it comes from fear. It comes from artificially creating data silos because they want to keep their competitive advantage. So it's really, again, going back to the governance side, it's not the tech piece that's the difficult, it's the human side of things that is difficult. And I think education has a big role to play about it because there is a lot of miseducation. There has been a lot of hype. So I think what we can do is to educate and to make the companies understand that, you know, they're going to continue to be challenged by platform models, right? So it's better for them to control the narrative. And with distributed systems, you are, you know, allowing these incumbents to do what many platforms are doing, but in a way that you don't have all power in one centralized company.
And Adrian, kind of take us inside the room when you're having these conversations with SMBs. You know, what is the pitch, and maybe where are you getting some resistance, and what does that look like?
Actually, we're seeing a lot of use cases. I think we're seeing more than we actually can handle use cases coming up. But I think the biggest trouble is that often they focus on technology. They're coming up and they want to explore blockchain, and they're bringing, and they're not coming from the business model side. So they're coming to us and asking about blockchain and want to do a blockchain project on something. And I think that's quite difficult because it's a technology, it's a tool for something, for trusted, valued information. Yeah, so we are seeing a lot of projects coming, but the valuable projects are rare. So.
Yep. And then I think we've got time for maybe one or two more questions. This one's directed towards Anthony. Again, something that we talked about earlier that I think we should explore a little bit more is around the misalignment of incentives amongst developers. You're a corporation and you're looking at a bunch of different protocols. How are you as BASF approaching that problem? I mean, how are you guys trying to incentivize development? How are you guys trying to build that out? And what does that look like from you organizationally?
Yeah, so I think that question goes back to sort of the strategy that I've taken with the blockchain lab, which maybe for a lot of corporates might seem a bit unorthodox, but you know, considering that blockchain is a very transformative technology, I think it sort of is a good approach. And so basically, I think it all has to go back to what I said before about, okay, how are we actually working with these core developers that are building out a lot of the components that actually make blockchain what it is. Like if you think about blockchain, okay, you could simply break it down and say, okay, blockchain is simply just a very specific type of distributed database, right? That has certain properties, right? Because, you know, it's not the only type of distributed database, right? There's master-slave databases, there's all these other types. But I think in terms of looking at blockchain as a technology, right? It's composed of so many different components, right? There's the cryptography component. You know, there's like the distributed ledger component of it, right? Just that aspect of it. So when you take all these things into account, you really need to think, okay, what are those key platforms out there that we think maybe have the most promise? So we've internally identified some of those, and obviously you can have debates all day with people. One thing I'll say, for example, is like, and again, this is just the BASF Blockchain Lab sort of viewpoint, but looking at, for example, like fully private blockchains, right? There's a lot of platforms that sort of structure themselves in that manner. I personally would, as like the representing the Blockchain Lab, would not probably try to build with that platform, simply because I think it takes away from the core tenets of blockchain, right? Because at that point, then basically you're just having like one company that's managing all the nodes, or you know, things are pre-selected in such a way where it's not really getting you all those benefits. So for us, it's okay, identifying one, those platforms that sort of align with our vision or how we see this technology moving forward, and then saying, okay, let's try to explore maybe building with some of these components, and then directly working with those developers to say, hey, look, we're not a big bad corporate that's trying to take away from the core mission that all these people are sort of in line with in terms of developing the technology. We're here to really help spearhead that forward. So again, a lot of it is like educating and upskilling our employees internally, teaching them how to build smart contracts, how to code in Solidity, and then actually like working with these people like on the proof of concept projects we're doing, and then, you know, moving forward and trying to scale it into pilots. So far it's worked. We're two of the projects that were originally POCs are now moving to a pilot phase, and we're very confident that we'll be able to demonstrate something really interesting and useful. And I don't think that would have happened if we hadn't taken this approach. And one other thing I would say too is another good way to align incentives with developers is taking those other value chain partners and showing them how you can have sort of this equal value for everybody, right? So again, we as BASF are sort of spearheading a lot of these projects, but at the same time, our mindset is, okay, let's get it up off the ground and running, but then eventually we sort of divest our like control and shares over the network. We want to have these other people coming in and sort of operating independently as nodes and making like equal contributions, because I think that's the way of the future, and this is the way I think we'll start to see people like really collaborating together. So
and I think it's super important to just call out, you know, we are not always very explicit when we discuss blockchain. We need to be explicit about, are we talking about the underlying layers, or are we discussing application layers? You know, tech stack, you have the infrastructure, you have network, you have applications. And I think it's very different to focus on selecting a blockchain protocol, specifically in how you incentivize, versus realizing decentralized applications. And I think maybe for many on the call, or who are looking at blockchain, the potential, the most interesting topic for you as well is, and what concerns many supply chains leaders, are not the underlying technical platform, but its applications and how and that they interact with. A very wise man, Henrik Jensen, and from Denmark, he once compared it like this. He was saying that blockchain, the base level foundation, what we just talked about now, is not a complete business solution. Think about it as a concrete foundation in building construction, upon which you have to build a 30-story building. It needs to be constructed, right? A blockchain grounded business, the platform, but again, it's one little piece of the overall solution. And I think we need to be very clear when we talk about considerations and things, where we are in the tech stack, and understand that people interact with it at different levels in the future.
So I want to kind of leave it with this, Nadia. Can you talk a little bit about the blockchain deployment toolkit? You know, how did you guys build this out? What's intent and purpose for the members in the audience? If you want to go check it out online, I think that would be a good kind of call to action.
Sure, and I'd love to also hear Adrian and Anthony, if they have any reading material they refer to. So Redesigning Trust Blockchain Deployment Toolkit is the golden standard in blockchain deployment. We worked the last 18 months on it, but we co-created it with partners around the world. So we had more than 200 organizations that was involved in that. It's specifically focused on supply chain logistics use cases. The idea is that we did all the hard work. We extracted all the lessons learned, failures, etc., and we embedded it into tools, resources, frameworks, really so that you, as you embark on your blockchain development deployment journey, can embed best practices and avoid costly missteps. Because let's face it, we hear very little about failures and what really went wrong. So we really try to incorporate that into checklists and things, tools that you can use to ensure you learn lessons from top experts around the world. And we really did have, your top consulting companies, startups, organizations, academia, governments really, opened up their books and what happened, and we could sort of aggregate it all together for the world to learn from, especially to help small, medium-sized enterprises who might not have the budgets, like some of us on the call, for large labs or consultants, etc. So we make it accessible. So please share on to those in your network, upstream, downstream, so we can put blockchain power in the hands of everybody around the world.
And Anthony, any good resources that people can be directed to?
Yeah, I'll plug blockchain at Berkeley here just because I spent a lot of time building the organization. But if you go to blockchain.berkeley.edu, we have free online courses. There's homework assignments if you want to do them. There's recorded lectures, everything on the basis of the technology, how to think about use cases and frameworks. And then if you're a developer, there's also a developer course on that website, which actually teaches you how to build smart contracts and work with Ethereum and stuff like that. If you're just trying to get news, a couple good newsletters are Proof of Work, MIT Chain Letter, Token Daily. Yeah, I would say, and if you're more technical, Week in Ethereum News. I think those are really solid newsletters to follow from people actually in this industry. So yeah, I think I would leave it with those resources.
Perfect. And Adrian, anything that you can recommend for everyone on the call for a call to action or next steps?
Call to action, call us. Blockchain at Pulse for search. Now, I think in Switzerland, if you look at Switzerland, there are two big networking organizations. That's the Crypto Valley in Zug, and that's the Trust Square in Zurich. I think there you have a bright you find all the startups mostly around blockchain in Switzerland, and it's quite a lot.
Excellent. Well, thank you. A huge thank you to every one of you. Thank you so much for spending your time, sharing your knowledge with us. We greatly appreciate it. To everyone on the call, if you'd like to get introduced to any of our panelists here or any of the founders earlier, just let us know at Plug and Play and we will make those introductions for you. So thank you again, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody.
So Frederick, I will now turn it back over to you, sir.
Thank you, Harvey, and thank you to our panelists again for this great discussion. To close out today's webinar, I'd like to give it over to Fazin Shadpur, Managing Director of Plug and Play Supply Chain.
Very good. Thank you, Frederick. Thanks to the presenters today, to the startups in our cohorts. We do these webinars partly for their benefit and education. I noticed that Jordi from CircleRise, who was one of the startups taking advantage of blockchain, is on. I hope him and the rest of the startups benefited from this. Thanks to Daniel, Andrew, Doug, and Colleen for sharing what they are doing in their companies and in their startups with blockchain. It's interesting to see the different approaches and the different product categories that they are each going after, from plastics to coffee to healthcare, and manufacturing. And thanks to Stefan for sharing his insights on blockchain, on the benefits of it, on the challenges of implementing it, and on what he has experienced himself. What Stefan left out in his introduction, by the way, is that he is a fellow industrial engineer from Georgia Tech. So I thought I should add that to his introduction. Thanks to Nadia, Adrian, and Anthony for sharing their experiences in supporting the implementation of a blockchain across different industries, regions of the world, and platforms. We have been looking at blockchain for the past 3 years at a plug-and-play supply chain, and we have explored many different applications and opportunities. As it was covered by the speakers today, we have seen the benefits of blockchain in terms of provenance. As Stefan mentioned, it is a relatively cheap way of achieving provenance and knowing where things come from and what they are, as opposed to the traditional methods. So we do hope to see more of that adaptation in the coming years. The adaptation of the smart contracts is another thing that we have been following and watching. And indeed, there is some traction, especially by commodity traders, in terms of using blockchains for smart contracts, considering that most of those transactions are arm's length transactions. The traction is good. And in terms of adoption of blockchain as a simple distributed database, the ledger, in recording track and trace data and the data from movement of goods. Many of the speakers and presenters today kept mentioning this interaction and this overlap between IoT data, which in many cases we have seen is the track and trace widgets, and blockchain, and the versatility of blockchain databases in recording them. I enjoyed the discussions that everybody had around the fact that we need to have some sort of consensus to get people on the same platform in order to benefit. Otherwise, we cannot have the benefits of blockchain. And so it's important to make sure that every player understands what's in it for them to join it, and also to de-risk it for them in terms of keeping as much of their privacy as possible for them, and making sure that they have control over their data and who sees it, so that they do not have a fear of competition, and as a result of it, not join the other folks along the chain. I hope you all benefited from this. I have to also thank my friend Keith Dirks for giving us advice on how to organize and structure this webinar. He's always a very generous advisor and counselor who I benefit from his generous time. If you would like to dig in deeper on this subject or any other subjects, please do feel free to reach out to myself and my team. We will be glad to organize a deal flow for you and explore the subject further. With that, back to you, Frederick. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Fazin. And thank you to everybody who tuned in today. As always, we very much appreciate you taking the time. And we hope to see you again soon at one of our upcoming events. 2 of them are highlighted here, the Toronto Innovation Day webinar and the final series, or final part of our 3-part series organized by our Northwest Arkansas office. The other events you can check out on our website, pmptc.com/events. With that, stay healthy and goodbye. See you next time.